The ballroom shone with the brilliance of 1,000 lights reflected in crystals and jewels. Esther Goldstein, a slender, elegant figure in a navy blue silk dress, glided among the guests at the gala ball with the grace of someone born into that world. Her designer heels barely made a sound on the polished marble floor, while the scent of expensive perfumes and champagne hung in the air. "Esther, darling," a shrill voice cut through the buzz of the party. Helena Vander Wood, wife of an oil tycoon, waved frantically. "Come, come. I need to introduce you to the new director of the foundation." With a rehearsed smile, Esther approached the group. Her brown eyes shone with a mixture of charm and caution, always alert, always representing. "This is Dr. Marcelo Ribeiro," Helena introduced a middle-aged man with a cordial smile. "He's just taken over as director of the Children of Tomorrow Foundation." "It's a pleasure, Dr. Ribeiro." Esther extended her hand, her melodious voice carrying just a slight trace of an accent that she had worked hard to soften. "I've heard wonderful things about the Foundation's work." As they exchanged pleasantries, Esther felt the familiar weight of the diamond necklace around her neck, a constant reminder of how far she had come, or how far she had run. Subscribe to the channel and press the bell to see now how this amazing story will leave you shocked. Esther at a cocktail party, laughing with a group of executives. "Summer vacation? We always spent a month at the family villa in Tuscany. I have so many wonderful memories from there. At a romantic dinner, gazing into the eyes of an enchanted suitor. My biggest inspiration? Definitely my grandmother. She was one of the first women to graduate in law in her time. A true pioneer. Every lie, every made-up story had become part of her over the years. Esther had repeated them so many times that she sometimes believed them, even for a brief moment. A lump formed in her throat. How many times had she wished these stories were true? How many nights had she spent imagining what it would be like to grow up in this privileged life she had invented for herself? The sound of a notification brought her back to the present. It was an email from the detective she had hired. Esther opened it with trembling fingers, her eyes quickly scanning the contents. "Ms. Goldstein, as requested, I have investigated the man identified as Yakov Levin. I can confirm that he is indeed from the same community as you. More worryingly, I have discovered that there is an active group within the Jewish community that has never stopped looking for you. Yakov seems to be part of this group. I recommend caution in your future interactions. I am available to discuss strategies on how to proceed. Sincerely, Rodriguez." Esther felt her blood run cold in her veins. It wasn't just Yakov. There was a whole group who knew about her past, who were still looking for her after so many years. Her carefully constructed world seemed to be crumbling around her. Every lie, every fabricated story now threatened to expose her. Lost in thought, Esther barely noticed the soft knock on her office door. "Ms. Goldstein," her assistant's voice startled her. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but there's a man here who insists on seeing you. He says he's an old friend." "A Mr. Levin?" Esther's heart raced. "Yakov, right here, in his office." For a moment, she considered having her assistant dismiss him. But a part of her, a part she thought she had buried long ago, longed for that connection with her past. "All right, Sarah," Esther said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "You can send him in." While she waited, Esther quickly closed all the files on her computer, hiding the evidence of her fabricated life. She settled into her chair, trying to project an image of calm and control that she was far from feeling. The door opened and Yakov walked in. Without his event official's uniform, he looked even more familiar. His eyes, gentle and wise, met hers. "Esterki," he said softly, using her old name as a bridge between past and present. "It's Esther now," she corrected automatically, her voice colder than she had intended. Yakov nodded, a sad smile playing on his lips. "Esther, then. We need to talk." "There's nothing to talk about, Yakov," Esther replied, trying to keep her composure. "That life, that person, doesn't exist anymore. But you exist, Esterki." "Esther," Yakov insisted, stepping forward. And there are people who have never stopped loving you, looking for you. Yakov's words hit Esther like a punch in the stomach. Love, search, concepts she had abandoned so long ago, convinced that no one from her past still cared. Why now? She asked, her voice betraying a tremor. Why after so many years? Yakov hesitated, as if weighing up his next words carefully. Because the community needs you, Esther. And more importantly, I believe you need it. Esther felt the walls she had built around herself begin to shake. The girl from the shtetl, who had been hiding for so long, seemed to be waking up. I can't just abandon everything I've built, she said, more to herself than to Yakov. No one is asking you to, Yakov replied gently. But maybe it's time to integrate who you were with who you've become. The words hung in the air between them, fraught with possibility and danger. Esther knew she was on the verge of a decision that would change everything. I need time, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Yakov nodded, understanding. You'll have time, but don't wait too long, Esther. Some doors don't stay open forever. With that, he turned to leave. At the door, he stopped and looked back one last time. Shabbat Shalom, Esther. I hope that one day you can say those words again and really feel them. As the door closed behind Yakov, Esther collapsed into her chair, feeling the weight of decades of secrets and lies. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to cry openly, the tears washing away years of repressed guilt and longing. The sun was slowly setting over the city, casting long shadows across the office. As night fell, Esther knew that a new journey was just beginning, a journey back to herself. The buzz in the office seemed louder than usual that morning. Esther, usually the first to arrive and the last to leave, entered the elevator with dark circles under her carefully applied makeup. The sleepless nights were beginning to take their toll. As she passed the reception desk, she noticed furtive glances and whispered conversations that stopped abruptly as she approached. Sarah, her assistant, was waiting for her with a tense expression. Good morning, Ms. Goldstein, Sarah said, her voice trembling. There's something you need to see. Esther felt a knot in her stomach. What is it, Sarah? The assistant hesitated before handing over a tablet. On the screen, an article from a corporate gossip column flashed ominously. Mystery at Goldstein Corp. Who really is Esther Goldstein? Anonymous sources raise questions about the enigmatic CEO's past. Esther's blood ran cold. Her hands trembled as she read the article, which speculated about discrepancies in her background and mentioned a mysterious visitor who had recently appeared. Who else has seen this? Esther asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It's been circulating throughout the company, Ms. Goldstein, Sarah replied, avoiding her boss's gaze. Esther closed her eyes for a moment, trying to pull herself together. When she opened them, her expression was one of steely determination. Call an emergency meeting with the board. Now. As Sarah hurried off to carry out the order, Esther entered her office and closed the door. She leaned against it, allowing herself a brief moment of panic before straightening her shoulders and walking over to her desk. The phone rang incessantly. Emails piled up in her inbox, most with variations on the subject, "We need to talk." Esther ignored them, concentrating on preparing for what would undoubtedly be the biggest challenge of her career. Minutes later, she walked into the meeting room. The faces around the table varied between concern, curiosity, and, in some cases, a barely concealed satisfaction at the potential downfall of such a powerful figure. Ladies and gentlemen, Esther began, her voice firm despite the inner turmoil. I am aware of the rumors circulating. Allow me to clarify. But before she could continue, the door opened abruptly. A middle-aged man, Robert Thornton, a senior member of the council, entered panting. Sorry I'm late, but you need to see this, he said, turning on the large screen on the wall. Esther's heart almost stopped when she saw the image. It was an old black and white photo showing a young woman who was unmistakably her, dressed in simple clothes, in front of a small store with signs in Yiddish. This photo, Robert continued, was sent anonymously to several members of the council this morning. Esther, do you have anything to tell us? The silence in the room was deafening. Esther felt all eyes on her, waiting for an explanation, a denial, anything. For a moment, she considered continuing to deny, inventing yet another elaborate story. But looking at that photo, at the young Esterki she had once been, something inside her broke. "Yes," she finally said, her voice low but firm. "That's me." The shock was palpable. Murmurs began to spread around the room. "But your background, Harvard, the summers in Europe," someone began. "All made up?" Esther admitted, feeling an enormous weight leave her shoulders with every word of truth. "I was born in a small shtetl in Eastern Europe. My family was poor, owners of a small grocery store. I ran away during difficult times and recreated my identity when I arrived here." The room erupted in excited voices. Accusations of fraud were mixed with expressions of shock and disbelief. "Silence!" Robert's voice rose above the chaos. He turned to Esther, his eyes hard. "Why, Esther? Why all this lying?" Esther took a deep breath, feeling years of pent-up emotions on the verge of spilling over. "Because I wanted a chance. A chance that the world wouldn't give to a Jewish refugee with no money or connections. So I created someone the world would listen to." The silence that followed was heavy with judgment and, surprisingly, a touch of reluctant admiration. "Everything I've accomplished here," Esther continued, her voice gaining strength. "Every deal closed, every innovation, every penny of profit, that was real. I built this company with hard work and vision. My past may be a fabrication, but my present and what I've done for this company are undeniably real." Robert studied her for a long moment before speaking. "The board will need to deliberate on this. Esther, we ask that you step down for the time being." Nodding, Esther left the room with her head held high, even though she felt her world crumbling around her. In the corridor, away from the accusing stares, she allowed herself a moment of weakness, leaning against the wall and closing her eyes. "Esterki, Ms. Goldstein," she said hesitantly, "the board requests your presence at an extraordinary meeting this afternoon." Esther nodded, her expression impassive. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind. Each day brought new revelations, new questions about her identity. The phone vibrated. It was Yakov. "They're going to try to destroy you," he said bluntly. "The council wants a scapegoat for the recent scandals." "I know," Esther replied, her voice strangely calm. "I'm ready." In the meeting room, the atmosphere was tense. Serious faces, accusing looks. Robert Thornton, chairman of the board, was leafing through a voluminous report. "Ms. Goldstein," he began, "the inconsistencies in your record are serious. Falsification of documents, fabricated identity. This completely jeopardizes your position in this company." Esther remained motionless. Each accusation was like a stab, but she had learned over the years not to show vulnerability. "All my results are real," she said firmly. "Every contract closed, every innovation implemented. My background may be different, but my work speaks for itself." One of the advisors laughed sarcastically. "Work built on lies is worthless, Ms. Goldstein." That's when something unexpected happened. Yakov, sitting quietly at the back of the room, stood up. "May I speak?" His voice was calm, but carried an unexpected authority. The council members exchanged surprised glances, but nodded. "I've known Esther since she was a child," Yakov began. "I know where she comes from, and I can assure you that the determination, intelligence, and ethics that have brought her this far are not lies. They are an essential part of who she is." A murmur went through the room. Esther looked at Yakov, surprised by his direct support. Robert snorted. "Interesting statement, but that doesn't change the fact that there was document fraud." "And what would be the standard procedure in such cases?" Esther asked, surprising everyone with her calmness. "Normally," Robert replied, "immediate dismissal and possible prosecution." Esther smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Before you make any decisions, I suggest you review the financial results of the last 5 years. Results that were obtained by me." Absolute silence filled the room. The board members began leafing through documents, calculators in hand. Esther knew what they would find. Record profits, successful expansions, innovations that transformed the company. That doesn't cancel out the lies, Robert insisted, but his voice had lost its initial conviction. No, Esther agreed, but it shows that my identity is much more than a piece of paper. It's what I've built, what I've accomplished. The meeting went on for hours. Negotiations, proposals, veiled threats. When it ended, no definitive decision had been made. Leaving the room, Esther felt something she hadn't experienced for years. Freedom. No matter what the outcome, she had finally stopped running away. Yakov was waiting for her in the corridor. So? He asked. So, Esther replied. The story continues. Her cell phone vibrated. An unexpected message. A photo of her mother, aged but smiling, with the words, "I'm waiting for you, my daughter." Esther looked at Yakov, discreet tears in her eyes. The cliff was just around the corner, and for the first time she wasn't afraid to look down. The week following the revelation of her past was a whirlwind for Esther. Rumors spread like wildfire through dry straw, each whisper threatening to destroy everything she had built. On the morning of the press conference, the office looked like a silent battlefield. Executives exchanged glances full of expectation and judgment. Sarah, her assistant, was pale as she handed over the last documents. "All done, Ms. Goldstein," she said, avoiding Esther's direct gaze. The auditorium was packed. Journalists, investors, board members. Everyone was eagerly awaiting the explanation that could save or destroy Esther's reputation. Yakov was waiting for her backstage, dressed formally, a contrast to his usual appearance. "Are you ready?" he asked gently. Esther took a deep breath. "I never will be," she answered honestly. The spotlight was waiting for her. Microphones pointed like swords, eyes eager for corporate blood. Esther knew that every word would be dissected, analyzed, judged. But something had changed inside her. She was no longer the woman who ran away, who made up stories. She was someone willing to face her truth. "Good morning," she began, her firm voice echoing through the auditorium. "I know you have questions about my past. I've come here to answer them." The questions began in bursts. "How could you have lied for so long? Are your diplomas fake? How can we trust you?" Esther answered methodically, without drama, without excuses. She told us about her childhood in the shtetl, about the war, about the need to survive that led her to reinvent herself. "Every penny this company has earned, every project we've developed, every employee we've employed, it's all real," she declared. "My background may be different from what I've told you, but my commitment has always been real." Then something unexpected happened. A figure stood up at the back of the auditorium. At first, Esther didn't recognize her. It was an elderly woman, dressed simply, with a scarf partially covering her hair. "My daughter," the lady said loudly in Yiddish. The silence was immediate. Esther felt the world stop. That voice, those words, her mother. "Mother?" she murmured, forgetting everyone present, all protocol. The lady walked slowly to the stage. Yakov helped her discreetly. When she got close to Esther, she took off her scarf, revealing a face marked by time, but with eyes that shone with love. "Estherki," he said simply. At that moment, all the hardness built up by years of survival broke down. Esther collapsed into her mother's arms, crying like she hadn't cried since she was a child. The room, once hostile, was now completely silent. Journalists forgot their pens, investors held their breath. "How?" Esther whispered in Yiddish. "How did you find me?" Her mother smiled. "I've always been looking for you, my child. Always." Yakov, standing discreetly to one side, watched the scene. His eyes shone with the satisfaction of someone who had accomplished an impossible mission. A voice from the back of the auditorium broke the moment. "Does that change everything about the company's credibility?" Before anyone could answer, Robert Thornton, chairman of the board, stood up. "What changes," he declared, "is our understanding of resilience. Esther Goldstein built this company with the same hands that survived adversity. If anything, that makes her even more qualified to lead. Shy applause began to spread. First few, then louder. Esther looked at her mother, then at Yakov, then at the audience. Her world had been completely transformed in a matter of minutes. The truth had finally set her free. The auditorium was packed. Journalists, executives, members of the Jewish community. Everyone was eagerly awaiting the press conference that promised to reveal the secrets behind Esther Goldstein. In the dressing room, Esther was adjusting her blazer, her hands slightly shaking. Yakov stood beside her, a silent but firm support. "Are you sure?" he asked softly. "I've never been so sure of anything in my life," Esther replied. The studio lights flashed, cameras focused on her every move. When Esther took to the stage, absolute silence filled the room. "My real name is Esterki Goldstein," she began, her voice firm. "I was born in a small shtetl in Poland, the daughter of Jewish merchants. My story doesn't begin at Harvard or in luxurious boardrooms, but in the narrow streets of a community that has survived impossible times. The front row, occupied by executives and journalists, remained motionless. Esther's every word was a revelation. I fled during one of the most difficult periods in our history, not out of cowardice, but out of survival. I reinvented myself, yes, but every penny I earned, every company I built, was from the hard work I learned in my community." A video began to play behind her. Images of her shtetl, her family, her journey from refugee to successful businesswoman. "My mother always taught me that identity is not a piece of paper. It's not a diploma. It's what we do, how we treat people, the values we carry." Yakov, backstage, watched with tears in his eyes. He knew the weight of that moment. Suddenly, something unexpected happened. An elderly woman stood up in the audience. Her eyes, marked by years of suffering and hope, fixed on Esther. "My daughter," she whispered. The auditorium froze. Esther slowly turned around. Her mother was there, real, true. "Mom," her voice broke. In a movement that seemed like slow motion, they met on stage. An embrace that carried decades of separation, of longing, of forgiveness. The room erupted in applause and tears. It wasn't just a moment of professional revelation, but a deeply moving human reunion. "I discovered something else," Esther continued after the emotional moment. "My story is not just mine. It's the story of thousands of refugees who have reinvented their lives, who have built something new without forgetting where they came from." Yakov approached, placing a hand on her shoulder. Together, they represented the strength of a community that had survived the greatest horrors in history. Questions began to be asked, some harsh, some curious. But Esther was prepared. Each answer was a layer of her true identity being revealed. "What about the forged documents?" one journalist asked. "A necessary survival in impossible times," she replied. "But I'm willing to face the legal consequences." Full transparency. On the contrary, for the first time in a long time, she felt something she hadn't experienced for a long time. Hope. Subscribe to the channel and press the bell to see now how this amazing story will leave you shocked. The sun had barely risen when Esther woke up, feeling strangely restless. For the first time in years, she didn't wear her usual designer suit. Instead, she opted for simple clothes, jeans, a discreet blouse, and a scarf to cover her hair. Yakov was waiting for her on the corner, as arranged. His wrinkled face lit up when he saw her. "Ready, Esterki?" he asked softly. Esther hesitated. "I don't know if I'll ever really be ready, Yakov." Together, they embarked on a journey that Esther had never imagined. The destination. The old Jewish quarter, the place she had left behind so long ago. The narrow streets and old buildings seemed straight out of a distant dream. Familiar smells, fresh bread, spices, invaded her senses, awakening long-buried memories. "Over there," Yakov pointed, "was your parents' grocery store." Esther stopped, staring at the building now occupied by a small bookshop. For a moment, she could see clearly. Her father organizing the shelves, her mother at the checkout, herself, still a child, helping customers. "Come on," Yaakov guided her gently. "There's more to see." They walked to the old synagogue. Esther hesitated at the entrance, her heart racing. "I don't know if I can go in," she whispered. Yaakov smiled understandingly. Sometimes the first step is the hardest. Inside the synagogue, time seemed to have stood still. The scent of candles and old books filled her lungs. Esther closed her eyes, letting the memories flow. Murmured prayers, the sound of the shofar, the sense of belonging she hadn't felt for so long. "Estherki," an elderly voice called out. Esther turned, meeting the gaze of Rabbi Levi, now much older, but with the same gentle eyes she remembered. "You've come home," he said, not as a question, but as a realization. The words hit her hard. Home, a concept she had abandoned so long ago. The day passed like a dream. Esther relearned prayers she thought she had forgotten, tasted food she hadn't tasted for years, listened to stories of a community that never stopped waiting for her. In the afternoon, Yaakov took her to a small apartment. "What is this place?" Esther asked, confused. "It's where your mother lives now," Yaakov replied softly. Shock paralyzed her. "My mother? Is she alive?" Before Yaakov could answer, the door opened. An elderly woman, her white hair covered by a scarf, her eyes tired but bright, appeared. "Estherki?" the trembling voice asked. "My daughter." The world seemed to stop. Esther felt her legs go weak. In an instant, she was in her mother's arms, sobbing like a child. "I'm sorry," Esther mumbled through her tears. "I'm sorry I left." Her mother hugged her tightly, as if she feared she would disappear again. "You're here now. That's all that matters." Hours passed. Esther heard about the years she had lost, about how her family had survived, about how they had never given up hope of finding her. When night fell, Esther found herself sitting at the table, attending a Shabbat dinner for the first time in decades. The blessing over the candles, the taste of the sweet wine, the aroma of the fresh challah, everything seemed new and, at the same time, deeply familiar. "You don't have to choose between who you were and who you've become," Yaakov said softly. "You can be both." Esther looked around, at her mother, at Yaakov, at the smiling faces of the community members who had come to welcome her. She felt something she hadn't felt for a long time. Peace. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. It was Sarah, her assistant, probably worried about her absence from the office. Esther hesitated, looking at the device and then at the Shabbat table. At that moment, she made a decision. She hung up the phone. "I think I have a lot to learn," she said, smiling shyly at her mother. The smile she received in return was like a ray of sunshine after a long storm. As the evening progressed, filled with stories, laughter, and tears of joy, Esther realized that she was at the beginning of a new journey. A journey of rediscovery, of reconciliation, not just with her community, but with herself. The road would be long and undoubtedly full of challenges. But for the first time in years, Esther felt that she was exactly where she should be. At home, Esther's office was different. The walls, once decorated with diplomas and awards that she now knew were fake, looked emptier. Scattered documents, investigation reports, newspaper cuttings, everything testified to the crumbling of her carefully constructed identity. Sarah, his assistant, entered with a pile of documents. Her face, once always professional, now bore a mixture of pity and curiosity. Knowing she wouldn't be able to go back to sleep, Esther got up and walked over to the window. Below, the city never slept, a sea of lights flashing incessantly, so different from the small Jewish village of her childhood. Her thoughts returned to the man from the charity event. There was something in him, in his gaze, that awakened long-buried memories. Was it possible that he knew her? That he knew who she really was? With a heavy sigh, Esther turned away from the window. She needed to pull herself together. Today, she had an important meeting at the office and then lunch with potential investors. She couldn't afford to look flustered or distracted. A few hours later, impeccably dressed in a Chanel suit, Esther walked into her favorite cafe. The aroma of freshly ground coffee and warm croissants usually calmed her down, but today she felt restless. "The usual, Mrs. Goldstein?" asked the barista with a friendly smile. Esther nodded, forcing a smile in return. As she waited for her order, her eyes wandered around the place, suddenly stopping on a familiar figure sitting in a discreet corner. It was him, the man from the event. For a moment, Esther considered leaving quickly, pretending she hadn't seen him. But something held her there, motionless, as he raised his eyes and stared directly at her. "Shalom, Estherki," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of decades and shared memories. The sound of his old name, pronounced with such familiarity, made Esther shudder. "I'm sorry, I think you have me confused with someone else," she replied automatically, the words sounding false even to her own ears. The man smiled sadly. "We both know that's not true, Estherki. Or should I say Esther Goldstein? That's what you call yourself now, isn't it?" Esther felt the blood freeze in her veins. She looked around nervously, fearing that someone might hear. "Who are you?" she whispered, unable to deny it any longer. "My name is Yakov," he replied calmly. "We grew up together in the shtetl. Don't you remember me, Estherki?" Memories flooded Esther's mind. A bright-eyed boy running beside her, laughter echoing in the narrow streets, the childish promise of eternal friendship. "Yankiel?" she murmured, using the affectionate nickname she hadn't uttered for decades. Yakov nodded, his eyes filling with unshed tears. "I thought I'd never see you again. Everyone thought. We thought you had died that night." The mention of that night made Esther recoil, as if she had been slapped. "I can't do that," she said abruptly, picking up her coffee and turning to leave. "Please don't look for me again." "Estherki, wait," Yakov called out, but Esther was already at the door, practically running out into the busy street. As she hurried to her office, Esther's mind was spinning. How had Yakov found her? What else did he know? And most importantly, what would she do now? One thing was certain. Her carefully constructed world of luxury and prestige was in danger, and Esther was determined to protect it at all costs. Arriving at the imposing building where her company was located, Esther took a deep breath, straightened her posture, and put her professional smile on her face. As the elevator doors closed behind her, she made a decision. It was time to find out exactly what Yakov knew and how much his presence threatened everything she had achieved. With trembling fingers, she picked up her cell phone and dialed the number of a private detective who occasionally provided discreet services for her company. The game of hide and seek that Esther had played with herself for so many years was about to get a lot more complicated. Subscribe to the channel and press the bell to see now how this amazing story will leave you with your jaw dropped. Esther's office, at the top of the skyscraper, offered a panoramic view of the city. But that afternoon, she hardly noticed the city skyline. Sitting in her Italian leather chair, Esther stared at her computer screen, where a folder of files entitled New Me blinked, teasing her. With a heavy sigh, she clicked on the folder. A cascade of documents opened up. Forged birth certificates, forged diplomas, invented references. Each file represented a carefully constructed piece of the elaborate puzzle that was Esther Goldstein. Her eyes ran over the dates, the names, the stories she had created over the years. She remembered every lie, every fabricated detail she had used to construct her new identity. Born in Boston to academic parents, she muttered to herself, going over the story she had told countless times. Studied at elite schools, graduated from Harvard. Flashbacks invaded her mind, a younger Esther nervous at her first important job interview. My parents? Oh, they were university professors. I spent my childhood surrounded by books. She heard her own voice, soft and confident, despite her racing heart. The conversation flowed smoothly, punctuated by polite laughter and the clinking of glasses. Esther skillfully navigated the topics, from the latest philanthropic trends to the latest exhibition at the City Museum. Every word, every gesture, was carefully calculated to fit perfectly into this world of opulence and influence. When the group dispersed, Esther took advantage of the moment to discreetly retreat to a quieter corner of the room. Her eyes scanned the luxurious surroundings, and for an instant, almost imperceptibly, her mask faltered. A flash of memory invaded her mind. The smell of freshly baked challah bread, the sound of Hebrew prayers echoing through the narrow streets of a Jewish neighborhood, the rough touch of her father's calloused hands. Esther blinked rapidly, swatting away the memories like someone swatting away an inconvenient fly. Turning to one of the huge mirrors that adorned the walls of the room, she examined her reflection. The woman staring back at her was the embodiment of success and sophistication. Perfectly groomed black hair, flawless makeup, dazzling jewelry. But for a brief moment, Esther saw beyond the facade. She saw the frightened girl who had left everything behind, who had buried her past under layers of luxury and pretension. Taking a deep breath, she recomposed her expression. This was neither the time nor the place for doubts. She was about to return to the party when something or someone caught her eye. A simple-looking man, wearing the discreet uniform of the event staff, was standing near the bar. It wasn't his presence that surprised Esther, but the way he looked at her. His eyes, deep and knowing, seemed to pierce through all her carefully constructed defenses. For a terrifying instant, Esther was sure she knew him. Fragments of memory danced at the edge of her consciousness. A cobbled street, the sound of children's laughter, the scent of spices. The man began to move towards her, his gaze fixed on her with a mixture of recognition and incredulity. Esther's heart raced, panic rising in her chest. She couldn't allow her past to catch up with her. Not here, not now. With a grace born of desperation, Esther spun on her heels and plunged back into the crowd, her silk dress billowing behind her like a smoke screen. Smiles were cast, greetings exchanged, all a blur as she maneuvered through the hall. "Esther, there you are." Helena's voice sounded again, this time like a lifeline. "Come along, dear. They're about to announce the total raise tonight." Grateful for the distraction, Esther allowed herself to be guided to the center of the hall. As the master of ceremonies prepared to make the announcement, she risked a glance over her shoulder. The man had disappeared. Relief and an inexplicable pang of disappointment mixed in her chest. Esther forced a smile as applause echoed through the hall. The evening continued, and with it the performance of a lifetime. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and Esther knew, deep in her carefully guarded heart, that her elaborate mask was beginning to show cracks. Esther's luxurious apartment, high up in a skyscraper overlooking the city, was plunged into silence. Only the soft purr of the air conditioning and the occasional distant sound of a siren broke the stillness of the night. Esther tossed and turned in the king-size bed, the Egyptian silk sheets tangled around her legs. Her usually peaceful sleep was restless. Fragmented images and long-forgotten sounds invaded her dreams. Suddenly, she was no longer in her modern bedroom, but in a narrow cobbled street. The air was impregnated with the scent of fresh bread and spices. Voices in Yiddish floated through the open windows, mingling with the sound of children playing. "Estherki," a familiar voice called out. "Estherki, my daughter, come home." Estherki turned to see her mother standing in the doorway of a small wooden house. Her mother's face, almost forgotten after so many years, was vivid now. Kind eyes, wrinkles of worry around her mouth, a colorful scarf covering her gray hair. "Mom," Esther whispered, feeling like a 12-year-old girl again. But the scene changed. The cheerful, sunny street gave way to shadows and fear. Screams echoed in the distance. Her father appeared, his face pale with terror. "Run, Estherki. Run and don't look back." Esther woke up with a jolt, her heart beating frantically against her chest. She sat up in bed, disoriented, her eyes frantically scanning the room until they settled on the digital clock on the bedside table. 3:47 a.m. Taking a deep breath, she ran her hands over her face, feeling the wetness of the tears she hadn't even realized she had shed. The nightmare, so vivid, left her shaking. It had been years since she had dreamt of the shtetl, of her parents, of the life she had left behind. The gentle voice made her open her eyes. Yaakov was standing there, his eyes full of compassion. "How did you?" Esther began, confused by his presence. "I'm sorry," Yakov said softly. "I didn't mean for things to come to this. I just wanted you to reconnect with who you really are." Esther stared at him, a mixture of anger and gratitude fighting inside her. "You don't understand, Yakov. You may have destroyed everything I've built. Or maybe," he replied gently, "I helped you free yourself from a prison you built yourself." Before Esther could reply, the door to the meeting room opened. Robert stepped out, his face an unreadable mask. "Esther, the council wants to talk to you, and..." He hesitated, looking at Yakov. "They've asked your friend to come in too." Heart pounding, Esther exchanged a glance with Yakov. Together, they walked back to the meeting room, ready to face whatever fate had in store. As the door closed behind them, Esther knew that, whatever the outcome, nothing would ever be the same. The cracks in her carefully constructed facade had become irreparable fissures. It was time to face the truth, however painful it might be. Night was falling over the city when Esther finally left the office. The day had been a whirlwind of emotions. Endless interrogations from the council, suspicious looks, whispers of betrayal. Miraculously, she hadn't been fired yet. The board had decided to carry out a full investigation before making any final decisions. Her steps took her, almost unconsciously, to a place she hadn't visited for years. A small, discreet apartment hidden away in a neighborhood far from the center. No one, not even her closest lawyers or assistants, knew of its existence. With trembling hands, Esther opened the door. The apartment was like a tomb of memories. Dust-covered old furniture, framed photographs, objects that told stories she had tried to forget. A wooden box in the corner caught her eye. Esther opened it reverently, revealing a set of objects that were her secret connection to the past. A silver Star of David, her mother's prayer book, a yellowed photograph of her family. His fingers traced the image. His father, stern-looking but kind-eyed. His mother, with a smile that lit up her tired face. Her younger siblings, hugging her. "Why did I run away?" Esther murmured to the photograph. "Why did I abandon everything?" Memories swept through her mind like a wave. They weren't just memories of poverty or hardship. They were memories of love, of community, of a connection that no financial success could ever replace. He remembered the night he decided to leave. The war had left deep scars in his community. Many had died, others had lost everything. She was young, full of dreams and fear. "I just wanted to survive," she whispered into the silence of the apartment. "I just wanted a chance." Her cell phone vibrated, breaking the moment of introspection. It was Yakov. "I need to talk to you," he said bluntly. "There are things you need to know about your family." Esther hesitated. Part of her wanted to switch off, to continue ignoring the past. But a deeper part, long dormant, yearned for answers. "Where?" she asked. "In the cemetery," Yakov replied. "There's something you should see." An hour later, Esther was walking among old gravestones in the Jewish cemetery. The night was cold, and a gentle wind carried the scent of damp leaves and history. Yakov was waiting for her near a simple grave. As she approached, Esther felt the ground slip away from under her feet. It was her parents' grave. "How?" she muttered. "I thought they survived," Yakov explained gently. "Your father died 5 years ago. Your mother is still alive. She never gave up on finding you." Esther's world spun. Her parents were alive. Her mother had been looking for her all these years. "Why are you telling me this now?" Esther asked, her voice laced with emotion. "Because sometimes we need to confront our past in order to understand who we really are," Yakov replied. Tears streamed down Esther's face, not of total sadness, but of a complex mixture of pain, relief, guilt, and hope. "I've wasted so much time," she whispered. Yakov placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Lost time can be regained, Estherki. Not all of it, but some of it, if you want it." The proposal hung in the air between them, full of possibilities and fear. Esther looked at her father's grave, then at Yakov. "What should I do?" she asked. for the first time in years allowing herself to be vulnerable. "First," Yakov said softly, "you need to forgive yourself." The phrase went through Esther like a bolt of lightning. Forgiving herself, something she had never considered possible. The night progressed, and with it, a journey of self-discovery and reconciliation began to unfold. Esther knew that nothing would ever be the same. But, for the first time in years, that didn't scare her. The board of directors, present in the front row, exchanged glances. The narrative was changing completely. At the climax of the press conference, a final revelation. "Today, I'm announcing the creation of a fund for young refugees, so that they can have the opportunities that I had to create on my own," Esther declared. The auditorium erupted in applause. It wasn't just a businesswoman speaking, but a story of resilience, of identity, of hope. When the press conference ended, Esther looked at her mother and Yakov. Silent tears streamed down her face. "I'm home," she whispered. The climax of her journey had arrived, not with drama or conflict, but with truth and reconciliation. Esther Goldstein's story was being rewritten, and this time it would be completely real. The morning sun streamed in through the windows of Esther's new office. No longer in a corporate skyscraper, but in a historic building in the old Jewish quarter, completely restored by the Goldstein Foundation for Refugees. Her mother was knitting in a nearby armchair, occasionally looking proudly at her daughter. Yakov was organizing some documents on a nearby table. The transformation had been complete. After the public revelation, Esther not only kept her position in the company, but completely redesigned it. The Goldstein Corporation was now a model of inclusion and opportunity for immigrants and refugees. "The first year's report is ready," Yakov announced, handing Esther a document. 50 scholarships awarded, 20 immigrant startups funded, 3 community centers established in different cities. The numbers were impressive, but for Esther, each number represented a story, a life transformed. The phone rang. It was Sarah, her former assistant, now the foundation's director of social projects. "We have an incredible candidate for the next scholarship," she said excitedly. "A young Syrian refugee with a technology project for early childhood education." Esther smiled. Every story of overcoming was a small personal victory. The door opened. A group of young students entered, participants in the Foundation's mentoring program. They looked curious, hopeful. Esther welcomed them like family. "You are proof that identity is not a piece of paper," she used to say. "It's what we build, how we treat people, the values we carry." Her mother approached, putting a hand on her shoulder. They didn't need many words. Love, forgiveness, and reconnection were in every gesture, in every glance. Yakov watched the scene, a discreet smile on his lips. He had fulfilled his promise to reconnect Esther with her roots. But her journey was much longer than anyone could have imagined. In the afternoon, a meeting with international investors. No longer the Esther who hid her origin, but a woman who celebrated it. Every presentation was a tribute to her history, to the history of her community. "We are not defined by what we lose," she said in her talks, "but by what we build from the ashes." The phone vibrated. A message from a former council colleague. "You have shown us the true meaning of resilience." As dusk fell, Esther walked through the community. She greeted people, heard stories, listened to memories. She was no longer a foreigner, but an integral part of the world she had once abandoned. In the small cemetery nearby, she visited her father's grave. He told her about his achievements, about the foundation, about the reunion with his mother. "I'm honoring his legacy," he whispered. When she returned home, her mother was waiting for her with fresh tea and hot tea. Traditions that had been interrupted, now restored. "Tomorrow is Shabbat," her mother said. "Let's get the family together." Family, a word that had once seemed lost forever, now took on new meaning. Esther looked out of the window. The city was preparing for the night. Lights came on, stories began. Her story continued, no longer as an escape, but as a celebration. "Shabbat Shalom," she murmured to herself, feeling each word carried decades of history, of love, of belonging. The rebirth was complete.